Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the war for BADAB. Last episode, newly minted Lord Commander Carab Cullen launched an ambitious plan to delve deep into secessionist territory and secure the fortress world of Sorengrad. Through a metric ass-ton of balls and not a little ingenuity, the Salamander's battle barge Pyre of Glory and the Raptor's War Talon managed just that. This was an incredible coup for the Loyalists, who had now secured themselves a heavily fortified base deep in secessionist territory, from which they could now launch further offensives towards the heart of the secessionists' command structure located on BADAB Primaris. But before Commander Carab Cullen could start picking out fresh wallpaper for his soon-to-be headquarters on BADAB, news arrived of the executioner's actions on the night-side moon of Chimera. This was one of the single most important communications hubs in the entirety of Loyalist space. Its massive astropathic communications relay hub not only sifted through the incredible quantities of data generated from all the various Loyalist military operations, both in Loyalist and secessionist space, they also interpreted and translated the often confusing astrotelepathic messages and relayed them from Vengeance Station, the command headquarters, and to the front. The vital strategic value of the installations meant that they had been heavily fortified. Furthermore, Carab Cullen had assigned the entirety of the Howling Griffins, elements that had arrived in the sector, to garrisoning this one single installation. 250 Space Marines, enough to hold off virtually any army, except, of course, for one of rivaling Adeptus Astartes. The Executioner's Night Hag had been running rampant in the Loyalist rear line for months now, but it had finally joined with the rest of the chapter's forces, moving to the aid of the Tyrant Huron. Their first target was precisely Chimera, and they reduced the vital installations to little more than shattered rockcrete and burning tech consoles. Although they did, despite having them at their absolute mercy, allow the Howling Griffins that did not directly oppose them to live. The original 250 Battle Brothers had been reduced to 100 or less catastrophic casualties for a force that had already suffered heavily in previous cleansing operations. But the fact that they had been allowed to live at all was a fact that both baffled Loyalist command and infuriated Huron. And so this is the position then, in the opening days of year 907 of the BADAB conflict. Cullen has taken one big step forwards, and then immediately an equally large one backwards, as his ability to communicate with the recently conquered Sorengrad, along with the Salamanders and Raptors located there, has now disappeared. It's frankly difficult to really judge who came out worse for wear through all of this. At the very least, immediately, it was entirely possible that Huron may have been able to launch a rapid riposte now that his enemies could no longer communicate freely. The problem, as already mentioned in the last episode, of course, is the simple fact that Sorengrad was a massively heavily fortified system, with a fully operational orbital defense grid and 2 Astartes battle barges in orbit. Even if he knew the extent of the communications blackout, attacking that kind of an objective would be expensive in the extreme. And unfortunately for Huron, the Imperium weren't the only ones who wanted a bite out of his pie. Left Huron, as we have discussed on multiple occasions, had quite the talent for finding new and interesting enemies in areas unlooked for, though this enemy was not one of his design or making. Instead, it was an age-old foe that always seems to know just the most inopportune moment to rear its ugly green head once again. The secessionists were, of course, lest we forget, fighting with their backs to the Maelstrom warp storm zone, the predations of which was the entire reason the warders had been placed in the area to begin with. An old saying about a rock and a hard place comes to mind. And the aforementioned hard place had apparently taken an interest in encroaching upon secessionist territory, this time in the shape of a major orc warg. And with the warders busy elsewhere, there was very little to stop it. As we have talked about on several previous occasions, even unrelated to the BADAB series, the best way to deal with an orc threat is to make sure it never gets organized. Continuous raids and assassinations on its leadership, destroying the largest tribe and ensuring that they are busy bickering with one another. But again, the warders have been somewhat occupado as of late and haven't really had the opportunity to go weeding. In our everyday humdrum lives, all that results in is a rampant garden infestation. In the 41st millennium, that very selfsame oversight results in the Gore Chomper Pirate Clan Warg, where tens of thousands of angry greenskins came roaring out of the Maelstrom zone straight into the Endymion cluster. At first, the warders weren't even entirely sure what precisely was going on. Their borders had slowly but surely grown ever more porous as their war with the Imperium continued. Tyrant's guard formations, Maelstrom squadrons, and of course the warders themselves were all needed on the front line towards the Imperium, meaning that the lines towards the Maelstrom warp storm zone grew ever thinner. This allowed for a massive uptick in pirate and raider activity in 907, and whilst the Loyalists would of course blame any and all pirate attacks upon the secessionists, and to be fair, a considerable quantity of them were just that, but just regular old pirates made up a considerable portion of it as well. Without the warders there to stop them, they found it easier and easier to reave deeper and deeper into not just secessionist, but also Imperial space. Areas that had never before been open to them due to the efforts of the warders now lay virtually unguarded, as secessionists and loyalists alike dedicated virtually all fighting power to the front lines. Once a raiding group was through that contested area, it was a pure bonanza ahead. The orcs did much the same thing, except they primarily interested themselves in supply shipping going to the Endymion cluster. At first, it was expected that this may perhaps be some form of advanced loyalist elements. After all, 2 battle barges had just appeared near Surengrad, and that was assumed to be impossible, so the Tyrant was not discounting anything at that point. Otherwise, it might simply be the usual predations of the Maelstrom. But the attacks were growing a little bit too frequent, a little bit too quickly, and when the reports of orc terror ships started emerging in outlying worlds, it swiftly became clear that this was far more than just a raid. And eventually, the orcs launched a full-scale attack upon Endymion itself, the heart of the cluster, and the Mantis Warriors' de facto capital planet. The invading greenskins were extensively mechanized and possessed large armored reserves that easily swept aside the minor PDF garrison located on the planet. forcing the Mantis Warriors to make all due haste back to their home systems to counter-invade their own capital world, and engage the enemy in a series of mobile hit-and-run skirmishes to whittle down the horde, before confronting the main armoured orc columns in the dust plains of Oarella, where they fought an extended armoured battle against the orcs. The Mantis Warriors used Devastator squads mounted in Razorbacks to move rapidly into advantageous position, engage orc armoured vehicles and killer cans, and drag them towards their own armoured formations, as rapid response forces of predators would move in to bog down the enemy armour, and then Thunderhawks launched from orbit would destroy them. After which the Mantis Warriors would retreat as swiftly as they had arrived, the whole fight taking no more than 30 minutes tops, before a second group would strike the orc columns from another direction. In this way, the Mantis Warriors pulled the orc horde apart piece by piece over the better part of a week of near non-stop extended combat. In decades past, this may have been a relatively standard operation, a successful one that, albeit not this deep within the Endymion cluster, and certainly not on Endymion itself. But whilst orc extermination operations were hardly anything new, the idea that the denizens of the Maelstrom were getting so bold as to push straight onto a capital world protected by the Mantis Warriors, that was indicative of a far greater concern yet to come. The Warders had been respected and feared in the Autonomous Zone. A great deal of the reason why Huron had been so effective was because of the reputation that he and his Warders had built. They could not possibly hope to cover even a small portion of the Autonomous Zone, but the fear of the seemingly ever-present Tyrant's Legion and the Adeptus Astartes had halted far more raids than their direct intervention could ever have a hope to have done. And yet now, that reputation was beginning to falter. As considerable a threat as 20,000 heavily armed, armoured and mechanized orcs absolutely was, it was in the grand scheme of things still a relatively minor threat. Of far greater concern was the reason why it became a problem in the first place. As the Warders began to investigate, Maelstrom Squadron scout forces were dispatched along the route the orcs had taken, and they discovered that the orcs themselves had not chosen to invade the Warders' territory. Instead, they had been driven out of their own little slice of the Maelstrom Warp Storm Zone by hordes of screaming, demon-infested chaos cultists. Now, as we have talked about on several occasions previously, the Maelstrom Warp Storm Zone was a completely lawless and ungovernable area, despite the occasional best attempts by Huron to change that status quo. It had resisted all attempts to pacify it, and it was occupied by thousands of mini-empires, tribes, kingdoms, fiefdoms, and little nations, constantly warring with one another and vying for their own tiny little slices of the Maelstrom. This was absolutely nothing new, but what was rare was that one of these conflicts spilled on over into the Autonomous Zone. Raids and pirate activity, that was business as usual, but a fleeing foe choosing to enter the territory of the Warders instead of fleeing further within the Maelstrom, now that was unusual. Normally, the defeated party would find it far preferable to engage almost any other faction within the Maelstrom, instead of trying their luck with the God Emperor's avenging angels. But once more, we return to the idea of reputation, and the ferocity of the Warder's reputation had clearly been waning for quite some time, to the point that now even the average pea-brained orc thought they might just stand a chance. That's a concerning misunderstanding right there, and one Luft Huron decided he could no longer let stand. He was not particularly interested in fighting a two-front war, but if he didn't send a loud and clear message now, he would only find himself with a more extensive one further down the line. And so he detached a battle barge from the front line under the command of Corlan Sumartis, one of his best veteran commanders, to delve into the Maelstrom warp storm zone and deal with those screaming demon-infested chaos cultists. Making an example out of the ones that had displaced the orcs should send a loud and clear message to the rest of the pond scum. Responsible for its delivery was 2 companies of Astral Claws, along with 30 First Company Terminator elites from both the Claws and the Lamenters. They made relatively short work of the garbage, but it was clear that the Warders had really let this threat grow for far too long, and they did suffer casualties both amongst the First Company elites and amongst the 2 Astral Claws companies as well. Losses that they really could not be affording right now. And even worse, the travel time. A battle barge along with 230 battle brothers taken off the front line for months as they travelled to the Maelstrom warp storm zone, eradicated the threat, and then travelled all the way back again. It was a tremendous amount of strength removed from fighting the real war for far too long. But Huron also knew that he didn't really have a choice in the matter. Again, if the Maelstrom got uppity, the war would only grow larger, and the cost of resolving that conflict would grow along with it. It would, however, turn out to be remarkably poor timing. The withdrawal of the secessionist forces led to a small lull in the fighting, albeit a very temporary one that we will get back to in a moment. But before that, this lull allowed the Loyalists to delve a little bit deeper into their own suspicions, which we touched upon at the end of last week's episode. Lord Commander Carab Cullen had begun to raise some uncomfortable questions as to the strength and the disposition of the Astral Claws. They seemed to be everywhere at once, fighting on every front line of the war, and also being embedded in considerable numbers alongside Tyrant's Legion troops. This despite the fact that they had been engaged in a war of near annihilation with the Firehawks chapter. They were not the kind of Astartes to simply roll on over and allow themselves to be ploughed. If they had been reduced, as they had now, to less than 30% of their full operational strength, it seemed inconceivable that the Astral Claws should still be at full operational capacity. Regardless of how large the Claws' resources may have been, or their reserves at the initial stages of the war, there was simply no way Space Marines could be replaced that quickly. But the potential implications of his accusation meant that Cullen needed to be very sure before he brought this matter up to anyone else. The Astral Claws right now were secessionists. They were rebels, and to a degree certainly enemies of the Imperium, but there is still a thick line between that and heretic traitors. So Cullen ordered his command staff to carry out a deep dive investigation. Every engagement in which the Astral Claws had faced off against Loyalist forces would be placed under a microscope to determine as accurately as possible the potential casualties that the Astral Claws had suffered over the course of the campaign. We can only speculate as to the frame of mind of Lord Commander Carab Cullen as he ordered this investigation to begin. Undoubtedly, he had his clear suspicions, but he also probably would not want them to be true, as it would mean crossing a Rubicon best left uncrossed, and also a radical change in the entire war. But slowly, surely, and unavoidably, the reports started to tick in. Half a dozen Astral Claws were confirmed killed in action here, another dozen in this engagement, 100 in this large-scale fight, another 24 bodies recovered after boarding operations, and so on and so on and so on, until the number crossed 1,000. Any real doubt had long since, frankly, been dispelled. But there was something magic about that number. 1,000 confirmed Astral Claws casualties. That would mean, under normal circumstances, that the entirety of the Astral Claws chapter, including their 10th replacement company, would have been eradicated. And still, all the engagements were not yet analyzed. The casualties were expected to rise beyond that 1,000. And yet, the Astral Claws were still fighting on every front, opposing every Loyalist maneuver, and embedded right alongside the Tyrant's legion. The Astral Claws were guilty of heresy. They had broken the rules of the Codex Astartes, and they had done so with conviction and severity. There were far, far more than 1,000 Astral Claws currently in operation, and the total number of them could only be speculated at. The reports were passed up the chain of command and eventually landed on Legate Inquisitor Jarndyce Frame's desk, who had already been aware of this for months. Some of the Astral Claws had been captured, you see, and the capture of these Astral Claws had not been communicated in a timely manner to the rest of the Loyalist command structure, having instead been relocated to inquisitorial interrogation facilities for enhanced interrogation. It's damned difficult to torture a space marine, but the Inquisition have had a lot of time over their lengthy and illustrious career to grow remarkably skilled at the art, to the point that even the God Emperor's unbending sons can be made more pliant with the correct application of time, patience, and various machinery. The Inquisition had been piecing together the story for quite some time now, and whilst they as of yet still did not possess all the cards, Carab Cullen's own investigation had somewhat forced their hands. And so they made it all public. Legate Inquisitor Jarndyce Frame officially condemned the entirety of the Astral Claws chapter as excommunicatis traitoris and sentenced them to death. There would no longer be any standing order for them to surrender or for them to be brought to Imperial justice. The sentence had already been passed. But in a rare example of clemency, the Legate Inquisitor refused to extend the condemnation to the Warders chapters. The Mantis Warriors and the Lamenters were placed under suspicions of heresy, but not outright condemned. Now, you might think that being under suspicion of heresy and then assaulted by several chapters of Space Marines might at best be an administrative difference. But not quite. The Lamenters and Mantis Warriors would still be allowed to surrender, and would still be given the privilege of an official investigation when and if they did, whereas the Astral Claws were now officially shoot on sight. Furthermore, this also meant the transformation in the overall conflict that Carab Cullen had been fearing. This was no longer an internal matter, a civil war or a squabble between brothers, something that could potentially be resolved. This was now an absolute war of extermination, and regardless of how much the Warders might make the Imperium bleed, it would never back down from this. It also meant an expansion on the war on a resource level. The call for yet further Space Marine chapters was sent out wider than ever, but more significantly was the transformation in the nature of the worlds seized and their potential consequences for siding with the secessionists or not siding with the Loyalists. Yes, there is a difference. And to help correctly judge this difference, Ordo Hereticus forces were now deployed en masse. Inquisitors began pouring into the sectors along with their own covert and operative teams and personal military forces. To enhance their authority, Scholar Progenium commissars would also be requested in increased quantities, and official inquisitorial stormtrooper regiments would also be deployed, partially to fight along the Astartes, but primarily for policing actions throughout the conquered areas of space. Up until this point, if a world had previously been in secessionist control and then fell to the Loyalists, it would be treated not much differently at all. It was an Imperial world that simply changed its flag and official allegiance back to its rightful masters, and vice versa with the secessionists. Now, however, if it fell to the Loyalists, its level of complicity in the Astral Claws heresy needed to be officially determined, and repercussions needed to be dealt out as well. Sidon Ultra would soon cease to be an exception, and quickly become the rule. But I mentioned that the Inquisition did not have all the cards, and I shan't torture you by slowly revealing them all over the course of God knows how many episodes. I'm not quite that greedy just yet as to make you wait for it, so let's actually have a bit of a delve into this, shall we? Because you might be thinking now, oh god, the Astral Claws and Luft Huron were evil from the get-go. They had committed outright heresy and tried to raise legions of Astartes to overthrow the Imperium. But that was not quite the case. One of the main reasons I love the 41st millennium, and so many others do as well, is because it is very rarely a question of black and white, clear-cut morality. Though that seems to be a point somewhat overlooked in recent years. Luft Huron did not start out with any grand ambitions to overthrow the Imperium, to secede from it, or create his own little pocket empire. No, it started with an act of mercy and compassion. The Astral Claws had been a well thought of chapter, and had been granted the ultimate honor of creating successor chapters. One of these was the Tiger Claws. And one day, long before the current war, one of their vessels, a battle barge bearing the identification of the Bakasura, had arrived in the Tyrant's domain, along with a little under 100 battle brothers. They had a very strange tale to tell. Apparently, whilst travelling through the warp, their ship had been sent astray. Now, this is a relative rarity, but it does happen. An unavoidable consequence of creating unstable tunnels through hell as the primary means of conveyance across galactic distances. Mishaps can have a wide variety of consequences, some more unfortunate than others. The ship could simply be popped like a soap bubble exposed to an erupting volcano with no forewarning whatsoever. It could be turned inside out in an instant, or be invaded by hordes of screaming demonic monsters. In the case of the Bakasura, it had been the victim of a time distortion, and it had arrived in an Imperium very different from the one that it had originally left. Its identification signatures and its hails were severely outdated, and they were unable to make contact with any of their brethren until, by sheer happenstance, they came across another force of Space Marines. The Stormwings, who were currently engaged in a battle against Eldar raiders. The Tiger Claws aided them and were resupplied and given fresh news about the state of the galaxy. The Tiger Claws learned of the fate of their home world. Their ancient fortress monastery on a planet known as Krodha had been long since destroyed some 1,400 years ago by a stellar catastrophe. Their sun had undergone problematic life changes, and its rapid expansion had left their homeworld a dead, radiated husk. Now, of course, Space Marines have access to ships, and so one would think that the Tiger Claws would have been able to escape this fate, and considering what a valuable resource Adeptus Astartes are, surely they would have been resettled somewhere, right? Except the Bakasura and its crew could find no mention of their battle brothers at all. It was as if they had simply just been wiped out immediately, which again seemed impossible. An entire chapter of the Adeptus Astartes killed by a stellar phenomenon, one that they must have been able to detect decades, if not centuries, before it occurred? Surely not. Surely not. There was no way. Some news must be out there somewhere, but first things first. The Tiger Claws chapter was now reduced to a single company. That obviously wasn't going to work out very well, and so the new de facto chapter master, ex-captain Vatala, left the Bakasura and his remaining battle brothers and headed towards Terra, intending to beseech the High Lords to release his chapter's stored reserves of gene seed into his care so that he may begin rebuilding the Tiger Claws. This is a usual part of the tithe of gene seeds. The Adeptus Administratum and, of course, the Magos biologists sample it for evidence of corruption, of heresy, or of degradation, but they also bank up vast quantities of gene seed to be used in emergencies, to rebuild chapters that might otherwise be lost, and also for the founding of further Space Marine chapters. And that is when things got mighty dark indeed. Chapter Master of Atala, travelling towards Terra, was never heard from again. His petition had been officially logged. He was awaiting his hearing and his day before the High Lords. He had arrived on Terra. The paper trail demonstrated this, and then he simply disappeared? A Space Marine chapter master does not simply disappear from holy terror. What happened next is open to a great deal of interpretation, but we know that the Tiger Claws eventually found their way into the Maelstrom zone, hundreds of years before the current conflict. I would reckon that the Bakasura learned of the sudden mysterious disappearance of their chapter master, and decided to go out in search of some allies. And they heard that their sire chapter, the Astral Claws, had been given a very important position as the warders of the Maelstrom. Perhaps they could offer their services. Perhaps they could be enrolled in the warders and be given a degree of protection. And maybe the Astral Claws' own political clout could be used to their benefit. This is, however, where our surety ends, as the Tiger Claws then disappeared and were never officially heard from again until one of them was discovered in an interrogation cell during the war. An Astral Claw, or at least so he appeared to be, was revealed to actually be a Tiger Claw, wearing the power armor and the insignia of the Tyrant of BADAB. We can draw some conclusions from this, bearing in mind we're entering into good old-fashioned speculation territory here, but I think the Bakasura arrived in the Maelstrom zone, made contact with the Astral Claws, and then began asking some questions. What happened to our chapter? To which the Astral Claws had no answer. They had been told that the chapter had simply been wiped out in unfortunate circumstances. And, well, these things are tragic, but they happen. They presumably had simply accepted the news at face value, and yet here were Tiger Claws telling them not only were they not dead, but their chapter's ancient homeworld had apparently been irradiated by a stellar phenomenon and not relocated. How had they been destroyed? In battle? In war? Accidentally? And the Astral Claws probably started asking the very self-same questions, and started digging, very quietly, mind you. And they didn't find anything either. No official paper trail, no reports, no mourning, no official notice of the destruction of a Space Marine chapter? Now that's strange. Suspicious, even. But what they did uncover were some whispered, half-heard rumors in lofty inquisitorial circles that the Tiger Claws were rumored to be a part of the so-called cursed founding, that they were somehow tainted and were better left dead. Now, this doesn't prove anything, but the Astral Claws had already had their own run-ins with the God Emperor's most holy and infallible Inquisition. And they probably ascribed a lot more weight to those rumors, particularly in light of circumstances. And so they decided to hide the remainder of the Tiger Claws as simply more Astral Claws. It was an act of mercy. It was to take in a lost chapter, probably targeted by the Inquisition for eradication, an Inquisition that probably had played more than a small hand in the eradication of the rest of the chapter. Nobody else needed to know about it. The Warders, the Lamenters, the Mantis Warriors, they didn't need to know. This was merely the Astral Claws protecting their own blood from what was almost certainly unjust persecution. But it did open a very interesting door under the reign of Huron. Its chapter had been expanded beyond its allowed size, and he had undoubtedly enjoyed greatly the additional strength of a battle barge and another company of Adeptus Astartes. And he was a very ambitious man indeed. He petitioned the High Lords, as we know, for an increase to the size of the warders, for another founding to be created to push into the Maelstrom Warpstorm zone, because he had seen how what could be done with just another 100 Space Marines. Another chapter, 2, 3, 4? What could he possibly achieve with such a force? He might actually do it. He might actually manage to conquer the Warpstorm. And hey, to be fair, from the results he produced with just the Black Templars on his side with the Tyrant's Legion, it sounds insane. But was it? We will never know, I suppose. But the lure was just a little bit too much. With petition after petition denied, and the High Lords continuing to simply just hand-wave away his concerns and his plans, Huron decided that he could do this on his own. He began withholding the usual gene seed tithe shipments to expand his own numbers, blaming other extenuating circumstances whilst growing his own ranks. He made very sure to scatter his forces across the entirety of the autonomous zone so that nobody would really suspect anything, including the Lamenters and the Mantis Warriors. They were simply stepping up patrols. They were spreading themselves thin to ensure the maximum amount of control over the autonomous zone. And the Lamenters and the Mantis Warriors had no reason to question this. The Astral Claws were an ancient and venerated chapter, their de facto superiors. If there were more of them around, it seemed, that was a good thing, surely. A good thing indeed. But then came the conflict with Carthago. Huron had been too eager. He had miscalculated. He'd been skimming off a little bit too much in the way of resources here and there, denying a little bit too many tithe shipments. He needed those resources for his Tyrant's Legion. Men need food, they need guns, spare parts, uniforms, training facilities, barracks, a countless number of things. Not to mention his ever-growing number of Astral Claws, of course, and their ravenous desire for rare component parts that could only be produced with the resources found in the autonomous zone. And the tithe fleet had arrived and things had started escalating at a rather brisk pace. He had tried to settle things legislatively, to try and deny Carthago's rights as much as possible to ensure his own, eventually resulting in the Articles of Just Secession, but Huron knew that this was a war that he could not afford, which is why he had tried to end it so swiftly. He had thrown caution to the wind and employed his full force against the Firehawks, against Carthago, and he had been months away from ending the whole thing right then and there, until the Imperial Triumvirate arrived. Now, mayhaps, we are casting some new light on the reason for their arrival as well. Perhaps the Inquisition had had its suspicions for a long time now, and had been building a case. Or, equally likely, they were simply assholes. Either explanation, frankly, holds about as much weight in my mind, knowing the inner workings of the Inquisition a bit more than I'm entirely comfortable with. I assure you, not all Inquisitors are complete assholes, but enough of us are to make the distinction a difficult one. And there we have it. The seeds of corruption was mercy. It was compassion, and it was helping one's very own child out of a very tight spot with some very shady characters. And if that was all, then Luft Huron, one might argue, had done frankly nothing wrong, but he fell to ambition and temptation. He had tried to rebuild a legion, essentially. At the height of it all, the Astral Claws were speculated to have numbered between 5,000 to 6,000 battle brothers. And Huron had even intended to reveal this fact to the Imperium eventually, but his plan was to launch a massive campaign into the Maelstrom Warpstorm Zone, to begin its conquest alongside the Black Templars, to get a foothold, and then hold that up and say, look at what I have achieved. I have taken inhospitable, impossible to settle area, and I have tamed it. I, for the first time in thousands of years, have expanded the Imperium's borders into territory thought to be inimical to human life. And I did so by ignoring parts of the teachings of the Codex Astartes. The benefits far outweigh the risks. Or at least that would have been his argument, and to be fair, with the return of Papa Smurf, Lord Robute Gilliman, and his complete and utter dismissal of his own Codex Astartes, operating formations of Space Marines at close to or beyond Legion strength, who knows? Maybe his arguments would have found fertile soil. But that was then, and way too much blood had been spilled for any argumentation now. One can certainly make up one's own mind as to the morality of Luft Huron's actions, and as to whether or not they could have been successful, and if that would have justified it, but the reality was Huron was now locked in a war with the Imperium that he couldn't get out of. Regardless of the actions of a certain Papa Smurf in the future, right now the attempt to rebuild a legion was not something the Imperium was going to simply just let slide. It did put the Loyalists in a rather precarious position, however. Carab Cullen had been laboring under the now false assumption that he was up against 3 Adeptus Astartes chapters and a few million Tyrant's Guard. That was an overcomable enemy with his current resources, even if the Tyrant's Guard had proven to be far more of a nut to crack than initially expected. But now it was beginning to look like he might, in fact, be up against a force equivalent to 5 or 6 chapters. And so all of a sudden the situation had gotten a lot more complex. Though a bright spot was on the way as well, as Vengeance Station received communications from a new force of Loyalist Astartes calling themselves the Minotaurs. They were reporting that they had already assaulted and eradicated a large garrison of Tyrant's Guards, and were now heading towards Carthagen space to introduce themselves. One step back, one step forwards. But at least now, all the restrictions were lifted, and Carab Cullen could begin to employ the full arsenal of the Imperium, whether he wanted to or not. Until next time, as always, I have been Art. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Until then, have a good day.